Now everybody looks like they're available. Very good. All right, I'm going to call the Winnebago County Board meeting to order. Tonight is Thursday, February 25th, 2021. And tonight's invocation and pledge allegiance is by board member Jim Webster. Mr. Webster.
Thank you. Bear with me. Bow your heads, please. Lord, thank you for the blessings you've bestowed upon us. You have blessed us with some glorious weather the past few days, while others have not been as fortunate as us. We pray they recover from the ordeals they have endured in other parts of this great nation. And so too, we pray for those who have had and still do suffer from the scourge of this virus as it has spread across the entire globe. Praise God. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Appreciate
Thank you.
it. Number 3, agenda announcements. I don't believe we have any alterations or amendments to the agenda, Mr. Thompson.
No, we're good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Number 4 is the roll call. Clerk Gummow, can you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This evening, we will start with Mr. Girl,
Present.
Mrs. Gorel,
Present.
Mr. Hoffman,
Present.
Mr. Kelly,
Here.
Mr. Lindmark,
Present.
Mr. McCarthy,
Present.
Mr. McDonald,
Here.
Mr. Neighbors,
Present.
Mrs. Red,
Present.
Mr. Salgado,
Present.
Mr. Schultz,
Here.
Mr. Tassoni,
Present.
Mr. Webster,
Here.
Mr. Westcott,
Present.
Mr. Arena,
Here.
Mr. Billich,
Here.
Mr. Booker,
Present.
Mr. Butita,
Here.
Mrs. Crosby,
Here.
Ms. Fellers.
Here.
Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, that is 20 board members present.
Thank you, Clerk Gummow. We do have a quorum this evening. Under number 5 from our agenda this evening is awards, presentations, public hearings, and public participation. Mr. Thompson, do we have any awards, public hearings, or public participation this evening?
No, Mr. Chairman, we just have the presentation from the Mental Health Board. That's it.
Very good. So this evening, we will be given a presentation by the Winnebago County Community Mental Health Board Program Year 2021 through 2022 grant update with Region 1 Planning Council Community Health Coordinator Jason Holcomb, Board President Mary Ann Abate, and Vice President Dick Kunert. Who would like to start the presentation? Mr. Jason?
Yes, thank you. May I share my screen?
Please do.
Very good. Well, thank you for inviting us to give you an update this evening and for your continued interest and support in mental health in Winnebago County. Since we last came before you and provided an update, we have completed a 3-year strategic plan and also launched a grant process, grant application. So our 3-year strategic plan, ultimately, we came back to that community support system framework that we talked so much about the last time we came before you and gave an update, and really, getting into some of the strategies that were developed. They all really come back to support this model, this idea of building an array of services and maintaining an array of services in our community that allow for individuals with serious mental illness and significant substance abuse disorders, adults and children, to live and recover in the community. And so the last time we came, we talked a lot about the environmental scan, getting that agency information about their wait times, about their number of staff, about their current capacity, finding the strengths and gaps that exist within our mental health delivery system. Since then, we then engaged the public in a participation survey to get their perspective about these different components of the community support system and where they perceive the highest priorities to be. And so you'll see here's the responses of that survey, disaggregated into a number of different breakdowns, including education, gender, perspective, which breaks down the difference between somebody who's living with mental illness or has a family member with mental illness or substance use disorder, a provider or administrator at an agency that provides services to individuals with mental health or substance use disorder, and then residents of Winnebago County who don't otherwise fall into one of those other categories. And we also looked at the difference in perspective with race and ethnicity, and then our aggregate score. And so the dark green there you'll see is for each group would be a response that was significantly above average. And then with the lighter green would be an above average response. That kind of orangish red color, the light orange red is a below average response, and then that dark orange red is a significantly below average response for that particular group. And so while there are some differences in perspective, you'll see that there's also some consensus in perspective. And where we saw a lot of consensus was that some of those clinical components of mental health and substance use treatment, like diagnostic evaluation, supportive counseling, and medication management, were consistently ranked as the highest priorities. If you just kind of use the eye test there, you'll see a lot of dark green. And similarly with crisis response, while it was a little bit more mosaic, it was still tending towards being very green and really dark green in some of those spots there, like crisis walk-in services in particular. And while all of the services throughout the community, if you look at the percentages, were generally shown to be a high priority, we see compared to the other categories, peer support, which includes the self-help and consumer operated services, were on the lower end, along with protection and advocacy. So these environmental scan survey, public participation survey, along with reviewing a lot of research and other community health reports that have been developed over the past 5 years, were really instrumental ultimately in helping us determine what the priorities for funding would be over the next 3 years, And so you'll see we developed 6 priorities. Priority number 1, mental health treatment, case management, crisis response services, family and community support, client identification and outreach, and housing. And since we do not have a full year of funding for this particular funding cycle, priority 5 and 6 will be part of future year funding cycles, but we're not included in this particular grant application. For each priority area, you see there's a breakdown of the service areas, and there's a definition for each one of those in the strategic plan, target populations, those system capacity outcomes. So again, going back to thinking about what those gaps were in the environmental scan survey, what are the improvements that we want to see for the organizations that provide these critical services in our community? And then how do we want to see that impact individuals and families who are dealing with mental health issues and substance use disorders? And then taking all of those things, improved system capacity, improved outcomes for individuals and families, ultimately, how do we measure that at a community level and see what is the overall improvement that we're going to see in our community as a whole? And so you see that in the farthest column to the right there. So following the publication of the strategic plan, we launched a grant application and went live on January 13th. There was a grant seekers presentation that was posted on YouTube to explain all of these kind of details in about a half-an-hour presentation for those who are seeking to apply for grants. There were 142 views on that video. We followed that up with some question and answer sessions on January 20th and January 27th. We had 20 registration and 48 additional views on YouTube for the first session, then 32 registrations and 29 additional views for the second session. The application closed yesterday. We received 17 total applications. Many of those included collaborations with multiple agencies. So there's a total of 32 organizations across all of those 17 applications. And the total request for funding was $11.2 million. The grants evaluation period has now started, so board members will be going into the grant portal to review those applications, to score them, and that will ultimately lead to decisions in mid-April, leading to funding agreements with these organizations who will be funded on the later part of April, with awards being announced in May and then funding beginning in June. All of that information can certainly be found on the webpage, and also the videos are all on YouTube. Certainly, if you are having trouble finding anything, please feel free to reach out to me, and I can certainly make sure that you have access to any of the reports or other documentation that you're looking for. And happy to answer any questions that you may have right now as well.
Thank you, Mr. Holcomb. Are there any questions from the board members? Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Holcomb, I think you touched on this, but just so that I'm clear, how will you be evaluating performance of the recipients of the grants?
So those outcomes that were identified in the strategic plan were also part of the grant application. So each applicant had to check the boxes in each one of those areas: the system capacity outcomes, the individual and family outcomes, and also the community outcomes, and determine which of those that they would be agreeing to be held accountable for. And then also to write a narrative in terms of how they would collect data for those particular outcomes and what their targets would be based on any type of benchmarks they have. So what is their current score in that, and what do they want to see for improvement? Or maybe what would be the type of improvement that's been seen in a best practice model community. And so there will, in those funding agreements, there's some accountability measures that will require reporting. There'll be quarterly reporting for each of those outcomes that have been agreed to. And there's the ability for site visits and audits and all those things to make sure that all of that, everything that's being done is congruent with the requirements of the board.
So the grant recipient is self-reporting on their performance, and then how long? So the grant, like annually, you're going to review their performance. How long is the grant for?
The grant is for 1 year. There will be quarterly performance reviews. Technical assistance and support will be provided, but ultimately the organizations will need to collect that data because they'll be the ones that are working directly with the consumers.
Okay, so each year they'll read this grant process will be done again, and you'll evaluate whether it's been successful?
Yes, so in the board members' actual evaluation criteria, there's 4 different categories they'll score the applications on. There's a 5th one that will get added next year, which will be if any previous funded applicants apply for another year, they'll be scored on past year compliance. And certainly if some of those accountability mechanisms are not met, then payments can stop during the program year. So we wouldn't wait for the full year if people aren't meeting performance goals. Those would be addressed much sooner.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. Mr. Girl? No, you got your hand up, so. Is there any
I
other?
did. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Is there any other board member questions?
Mr. Chairman, this is Angela Fellers. I have a question.
Yes, Ms. Fellers, please.
All right, thank you so much for that presentation and for giving us an update on those things. I'm always happy to align with Region 1 and I'm a big fan of the work they do. Can you please describe briefly the process of distributing the questionnaires and what steps were taken to make sure that we were getting responses from traditionally underserved or underrepresented communities? And can you please speak to the socio-demographic backgrounds of those who answered the surveys?
Sure. We reached out through many community-based organizations. And so that original list of, I think, 125 organizations that we had that deliver services, we contacted all of those agencies as well and asked them to reach out and share on their social media pages and other ways that they might reach the clients that they work with and serve. So, you know, in addition to trying to reach underserved populations or underrepresented populations, we also really had a high value on lived experience and wanting to reach those who actually utilize the services that we're talking about improving. And so we did get a large response. Angela, I'm sorry, I don't have all of the numbers in front of me right now. So if you wanted to reach out to me, I could probably get you more specifics in terms of the percentages of those different demographic breakdowns.
I appreciate that. I was really just looking for acknowledgement and confirmation of mindfulness, which I think you satisfied. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fellers. Mr. Salgado?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question for you guys. You kind of touched a little bit on the performance and evaluation of how they're performing. Are there any benchmarks that you guys are using to kind of assess what's going on that they're trying to do based on their grants awards? How are you guys managing the performance based on any benchmarking that you guys will be using for those grants?
Yeah, great question. We're in process of developing those. A lot of the key information and content that we need is going to be baked in those grant applications. And so with that process just ending yesterday, we allowed for long sections of narrative for each one of those outcome areas, asking organizations to specifically identify how they were going to collect the data, what their targets were, what their current benchmarks were, and to identify what type of best practice, you know, they're, I guess, using to demonstrate why their target should be what it is. And so as we're reviewing applications, we'll also be going through some of those specific information that organizations provided about benchmarks and targets and kind of using that, I think, as a starting place, as well as looking at potentially benchmarking specific programs against how those programs have performed in other communities.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Mr.
Salgado.
Chairman,
Yes, Ms. Gorel.
my question is, Mr. Holcomb, when you go through the process and whomever receives the grant, if they don't use it within a specific time or they have monies left over, will they be giving it back to your group?
Absolutely, yes, and that is dictated in the funding agreement. So not only if they don't spend it because they had hiring short, you know, they didn't hire as fast as they wanted, or if they had additional revenues that came in for the program that were unexpected, all of it, that will be dictated in the funding agreement that should be returned to the mental health fund.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gorel. Mr. Salgado?
Sorry, another follow-up question. And maybe you spoke to this. Do you have on the different categories that you guys have on the awards, is there a specific dollar amount that you guys would award to some of these institutions, like the 17 that applied? Is there a dollar amount that you guys are going to designate for those type of awards, or how's that process? I guess I don't know if I missed that portion.
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, and please correct
Yep.
me if not, I think you're asking how will we ensure that the different priority areas are somewhat equally funded, or that each of the areas gets coverage?
Yeah, that's part of it, but more importantly, it's like, say, for example, there's an institution out there and they applied for a chunk of it. Is there specific dollar amounts that you are awarding, or is it based on the, say, for example, the outreach that they're going to do, plus the personnel, the scope of work they're going to do? So I'm just trying to figure out and assess essentially what is there a particularly amount of award, dollar amount for some of the awards, or is it strictly based on the scope of work and the outreach that they're going to do?
Okay. Yeah, okay. So with each proposal, there was a detailed budget that was required that detailed all of the revenue streams that might be associated with that program, as well as line items for the expenses, including staff, any commodities, any other types of expenses that might be associated with the program. So as a starting place, we're requesting essentially from the organizations the amount that they thought they would need to fund their program according to the alignment with the strategic plan. But certainly the board will be reviewing that. And as we rank and score applications, as I mentioned, we received requests for $11.2 million. We were approved to award $8.8 million. So we will have to either not award some programs that are not evaluated and scored as highly, or also have the ability to go back to organizations and say, could you shave this part out of your budget, or could you cut this and bring the cost down?
Okay, sounds good. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Red.
Thank you, Chairman. I have a question. Mr. Holcomb, are you able to, or can you share with us who the applicants are? I could not see your chart very well, so I don't know if it was on there.
I did not list the applicants on the chart, and I don't have the list right in front of me. We are in the review process, and so we have not publicly released that information yet. I think the intention was to review all of the applications and determine what types of awards would go out, and then to release that publicly. But I think if that information were being requested from a board member outside of, through a different avenue, I think we could provide that information through an email or something like that.
I would like to see that, and thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Red. Mr. Billich.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll make mine quick. I didn't want to make it too long, but my question is that, so we have a list of people that we're doing a grant process for from this fund source that we created. My concern is from the start with the mental health board was to try to attack a problem that we have in our community. So is part of this process the expansion of services? Because that was the biggest thing that, if we're talking about grant process, these are organizations that are already in existence that are already doing work. But is this going to expand what they're doing to attack this problem that we've had with mental health in our area in a bigger way, and be able to create a better environment for those individuals?
Yes, absolutely. So, the strategic plan, everything that was proposed had to be in alignment with the strategic plan. So it was focused. It's not simply a responsive grant process where people are just making pitches to the board. It is a strategic grant process where there was some required focus around services and also target populations and these outcomes. In addition to that, to address your concern about kind of expansion of services, it was clearly dictated, and the funding agreements will also dictate that these funds not supplant any existing funding. So really all of the services that are being provided in some way should be the expansion, or in some cases, maybe if some critical revenue has been lost due to COVID-19, maybe filling the gap there.
You're good, Mr. Billich? Good, thank you. Any further board member questions? Mr. Neighbors?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank Mr. Holcomb, Marianne Abadi, Dick Cooner, and the rest of the board for doing a great job and doing diligent work on seeking out the needs of the community and working hard to try to fill those gaps where, you know, we need to fill those gaps in the community, and working with the organizations that are working with them. And I like to say kudos to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neighbors, and I believe we all
Thank
feel the
you.
same way. Marianne Bhatti or Mr. Cooner, did you have anything to say to the board this evening?
Well, I just want to thank you all for, inviting us tonight. Obviously, Jason did a fine report, and he has been such an asset. And we thank you very much for allowing this mental health board, number one, to be formed, and number two, to do the work that was needed to ensure that we could have an expanded system of mental health and substance abuse care in our county that will allow impact so many facets: the police department, the jail, the emergency rooms, and allow people living with mental illness to have quality of life. And we are very excited about the potential that this funding is going to allow those that have, really suffered and endured and been able to be so resilient during very difficult times. So, and also Angie Goral has been an advocate from day one. And I just want to tell Angie that, we are so appreciative of her leadership from the county board perspective. And thank you, Mr. Chiarelli, for allowing us this opportunity. Jason is, and Dick was trying to join us. Maybe he is on.
Yeah.
I am.
Oh, good. Okay, very good. Then Dick may have a few words to add. Thank you.
Thank you.
The only thing I would share with you, thank you, number one, for letting us come and share tonight. But for 15 years of my life, I managed the grants at Singer Mental Health Center that we had for 9 counties in what was then our territory. Later on, it was 26 counties. But my only point is, I think you would be proud of the process that's been developed by the board to deal with the grants. It really is a very sophisticated process. There is total accountability through it, and that is our attention. That knowing that that's what you want. You want every single one of these dollars to be spent well and do the clinical work that was our intent to even getting this sales tax. So thank you very much, and we really intend to give you the best that we possibly can through this process.
Thank you, Mr. Cooner, and thank you, Marianne Bhatti and Mr. Holcomb. And thank you, Mr. Neighbors, also for your work on the board, and Angie Goral.
I want to also thank Tim Neighbors for his leadership. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So is there anything further from the board members? Okay, well, thank you all for your presentation. We look forward to seeing you and hearing from you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we will move on to our agenda item number 6 under approval of minutes. Can I entertain a motion to approve the minutes from January 28th, 2021 and lay over the minutes of February 11th, 2021. I've got a motion by Mr. Neighbors and a second by Mr. Girl. Thank you. Is there any questions about the minutes? Hearing none, Clerk Gumbau, can you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mrs. Gorel.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Hoffman.
Yes.
Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Lindmark.
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy.
Yes.
Mr. McDonald.
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors.
Yes.
Mrs. Red.
Yes.
Mr. Salgado.
Yes.
Mr. Schultz.
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni.
Yes.
Mr. Webster.
Yes.
Mr. Westcott.
Yes.
Mr. Arena.
Yes.
Mr. Billich.
Yes.
Mr. Booker.
Yes.
Mr. Butita. Mr. Butita. Mrs. Crosby.
Yes.
Mrs. Fellers.
Yes.
Mr. Girl.
Yes.
One last time for Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
Thank you,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly. Mr. Butita.
Yes.
Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, that is 20 board members, all yes.
Vote was 20 yes. Thank you. We move on to agenda item number 7 is the consent agenda for the raffle report and the auditor's report. May I entertain a motion to approve, please? We got Mr. Hoffman and Mr. Neighbors is second. Thank you. Is there any discussion on the consent agenda? Hearing none, Clerk Gumbau, can you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel.
Yes.
Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, that is 20 yes.
The consent agenda is approved. Thank you. Number 8 on our agenda are appointments. Per the county board rules, board chairman appointments will require a 30-day layover unless there is a suspension of rules. We have 3 categories this evening of appointment and reappointments. The first is the Winnebago County Zoning Board of Appeals. I'm placing up for reappointment Tom Walsh, Tamara Verstrade, and Edward Conklin. All 3 are reappointments to their current positions on the Winnebago County Zoning Board of Appeals. Under B is the Otter Creek Lake Utility District. That gentleman is Roger Allen. He is a new appointment replacing Edwin Herman. And under C is the University of Illinois Extension Board. We have 3 reappointments, which are 3 board members. The first is Angie Gorel, Aaron Booker, and Jim Webster. And I place those before you this evening for your consideration.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Ms. Crosby.
I move we suspend the rules.
Do we have a motion to suspend the rules? Is that for all 3 categories?
That is for all 3 categories.
Okay, so we have a motion to suspend the rules for A, B, and C. Do I have a second? We got Mr. Billich and Mr. McCarthy is second. Is there any discussion on the suspension? Mr. Arena?
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if discussion of suspension is permitted under Robert's rules, but can we vote on the suspension on these items separately?
You may.
Okay, So I'd
Yes.
like the vote to be separate for each item.
Very good. Is there any other comments or questions about that?
Mr. Chairman, this is Angela Fellers.
Ms.
Do you, may we please get clarification as to whether or not there is discussion allowed?
Discussion on the suspension?
I'll
Yes.
check.
Okay, Ms. Vaughn, would you assist in that question?
Oh, no.
Sorry, I'm having video issues this evening.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm on my phone.
Can you repeat the question, Ms. Fellers?
My question is whether or not discussion is allowed on a motion to suspend the rules.
I don't believe it is.
Very good. We'll go with that ruling. Unless there's other opinions, but I believe that's correct for this evening. Okay, so we have a motion to suspend the rules and we're going to take them individually. We'll start with 8A, which is the Winnebago County Zoning Board of Appeals.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
In order to bifurcate them, doesn't that have to be a motion to bifurcate them individually?
How would you like to, I'm not sure of your question, Ms. Crosby.
My motion was to suspend the rules for all three.
Correct.
And then we found out that we can't have any discussion, but board member Arena did bring forward a request, but he never amended the original motion to separate everything out. So are we in order here is my question.
Good question. And maybe that was my error. Ms. Vaughn, the question is, there was a motion to suspend all three categories A, B, and C, and then an amendment offered up by Mr. Arena to separate those A, B, and C for consideration. Should we take a vote on that amendment?
Yes, we should.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Crosby, for that.
So I will second Mr. Arena's motion to amend to bifurcate the three different categories of appointments.
Very good. So we have a motion and a second to bifurcate for categories A and C. Is there any discussion on that? Mr. Girl?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a point of order. Did we ever vote to suspend the rules in the first place?
No, we're amending the suspension. Before
Right.
it could get voted on, it was amended.
We'll vote on the amendment first and then we'll vote on the suspension as amended.
Thank you.
Okay. So Clerk Gumbau, can you call the roll on the amendment to the suspension?
I'd love to, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors.
No.
Was that a no?
That's correct.
Those are no.
Thank you for clarifying that. Mrs. Red,
No,
Mr. Salgado,
I'm a no.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
No.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
No.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, that is 15 yes and 5 no.
Thank you, Clerk Gumbau. So the motion to bifurcate the suspension of the categories, we'll call them, has been approved. So now I would like to have the clerk call the roll on the suspension of the rules.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
We will start with Mr. Lindmark.
No.
So point of order, this is just for A, right, that we're voting now? To suspend on A?
I don't believe we voted on suspending the rules at all yet. Is that correct, Ms. Vaughn?
Correct, we have not.
So now we're voting to suspend the rules for item A, correct?
Correct. No, for all three, Paul.
Ms. Vaughn, I believe this is for, we suspended the rules. We amended the suspension to bifurcate.
Right,
That was approved.
that's
Now
right.
we're- Yeah, so now we're voting on the approval of the suspension of the rules to
Proceed.
appointments tonight. So my opinion is we will be voting on number 8A first. For the,
That's my opinion as well.
so just to clarify, we're voting on 8A to suspend the rules. So it can be placed up for passage this evening. Okay?
Mhm.
Okay, so Clerk Gumow, can you please call the roll?
Certainly, and I will clarify, Mr. Lindmark.
No.
Okay, Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
No.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
No.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
No.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, that is 16 yes and 4 no.
Thank you, Clerk Gumow. So the rules have been suspended for 8A. And is there a motion to place 8A up for passage for this evening? I've
So
got
move.
Ms. Crosby and second by Ms. Gorel. And Mr. Arena, is there any discussion? Hearing none. Clerk Gumow, can you please call the roll on 8A?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. We will start with Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark.
Yes.
Thank you all, Mr. Chairman. That is 20 yes.
Thank you so 8A for the Winnebago County Zoning Board of Appeals reappointments have been approved. Thank you. We'll move on to 8B is the Otter Creek Lake Utility District Board. Do we have a motion to suspend 8B? Approval by Gene Crosby and Mr. Webster, second. Is there any discussion on that? Vote? Okay, I'm sorry for that. Okay, Clerk Gumow, can you please call the roll for the suspension of 8B?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. McDonald,
No.
Mr. Neighbors,
No.
Mrs. Red,
No.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
No.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
No.
Mr. Arena,
No.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
No.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
No.
Mr. Girl,
No.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
No.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
No.
Mr. McCarthy,
No.
Mr. Chairman, motion fails. That's 8 yes and 12 no.
Very good. So motion has failed to suspend the rules on 8B. So that will be laid over for 30 days. Thank you for everyone on that. 8C is the University of Illinois Extension Board for our 3 board members up for reappointment this evening. Is there a motion to suspend the rules on 8C? Ms. Crosby, a motion to suspend. Is there a second? Mr. McCarthy is the second. Very good. Clerk Gumbau, can you please call the roll for the suspension of 8C, please?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Neighbors,
No.
Mrs. Red,
No.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
No.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
No.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
No.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
No.
Mr. Girl,
No.
Mrs. Gorel,
I abstain.
Mr. Hoffman,
No.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald.
No.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, that would be 10 yes, 9 no, and 1 abstention.
So that is that did not pass, correct?
No,
Did.
10 yes.
Oh, it did pass.
No.
Point of order, it requires 2/3 to pass.
Okay.
2/3 of those present.
Correct.
So that did not pass.
Did not pass.
Did not pass.
All right, very good. Thank you for that clarification. So item 8C, University of Illinois Extension Board reappointments will be laid over for 30 days. Thank you, everybody. We'll move on to item number 9 is the reports of standing committees. We have the Finance Committee with Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have 6 items tonight. The first item is the ordinance for approval of budget amendment for reimbursable technology expenditures to be laid over. Item 3, ordinance for approval of budget amendment for reimbursable technology expenditures to be laid over. I'd like to group these 2 and suspend the rules and vote on today, and I so move on that.
Very good. We have a motion by Mr. Salgado and a second by Mr. Neighbors to 2 and 3 together, the 2 ordinances. Is that correct, Mr. Salgado?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing or seeing none, Clerk Gumbau, can you please call the roll?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. We'll start with Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors, Mr. Neighbors.
Yes.
Okay, one last time for Mr. Kelly. Okay, Mr. Chairman, that is 19 yes and 1 absent and not voting.
Very good. Thank you, Clerk Gumbau. The motion has been approved. Mr. Salgado, did you want to make a next motion?
Yes, just for clarification, we were motioning to suspend the rules, right, to vote on it.
That's
All right.
correct.
I just want to make sure. All right, then I move to approve items 2 and 3, which are ordinance to approve of a budget amendment for reimbursable technology expenditures.
Very good. We have a motion to approve this evening, 9, 2, and 3. Do I have a second? Mr. Lindmark, second. Mr. Neighbors, second. Is there any discussion on items 9, 2, and 3, the ordinances? Hearing and seeing none. Clerk, can you call the roll on items 2 and 3, please?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Salgado,
I'm a yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott, Mr.
Yes.
Westcott. Was that a yes?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Lindmark, Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red.
Yes.
One last time for Mr. Kelly. I think I got a thumbs up from Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, that would be 20 yes with Mr. Kelly.
Very good. The motion to approve items 9, 2, and 3, the ordinances for approval of budget amendments for reimbursable technology expenditures have been approved. Thank you. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Items 4, 5, 6, and 7 are resolutions authorizing settlement claim against the county of Winnebago. I would like them together and vote on them as a whole package, as there are claims against the county of Winnebago. And so I'd like to motion that to combine all 4, 5, 6, and 7.
Very good, Mr. Salgado. We have a motion to approve item 4, 5, 6, and 7. These are all resolutions authorizing settlements of claims against the county of Winnebago. And I have a second by Mr. Girl and Mr. Arena. Is there any discussion on 4, 5, 6, or 7?
If I may, real quick, Mr. Chairman, So I just want to break down the dollar amounts and the individual or the case. So the first one is Ryan Beckett versus Winnebago County in the amount of $19,446.44. The second one is Heinrich versus Winnebago County in the amount of $33,979.07. The third one is David Kniff versus Winnebago County in the amount of $19,046.48. And then the final one is Jody Miller versus Winnebago County in the amount of $25,499.33.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, Clerk Gumbel, can you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes, vote.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado.
Yes.
Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, that is 20 yes.
Thank you. The motion has been approved for items 4, 5, 6, and 7. Those are the resolutions authorizing settlement claims against the Winnebago County. Thank you, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you.
Anything further from the Finance Committee, Mr. Salgado?
No, that concludes.
Very good. Thank you. We'll move to 9B, which is the Zoning Committee. Mr. Webster.
Okay, thank you. Zoning Committee has 2 items for a first reading to be read into layover to be voted on at our next board meeting. So item number 1 is SU 0420, it's a special use permit. And the companion piece to that, number 2 is SU 0520, which is also a special use permit. And these come to you with conditions as they are special uses. So that's for the record, and we'll vote on them in a couple weeks.
Okay, so items B1 and 2 are automatically laid over. Anything further, Mr. Webster?
No, that's all we have. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Webster. Item number C is the Economic Development Committee. Mr. Billich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have no report for tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Billich. Item number D is the Operations and Administrative Committee. Mr. Keith McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have no report for this evening.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Item 9E is the Public Works Committee. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My notes are a little abbreviated here because I don't have my agenda up, internet trouble. But the first item is resolution 21-002. It's a resolution retiring of MFT bonds. It's an annual item for $1,450,000. I would so move.
We have a motion by Mr. Tassoni to approve and a second by Mr. Girl and Mr. Neighbors. Is there any discussion? Hearing and seeing none, Clerk Gumbel, can you please call the roll?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
He stepped away for a minute.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red, Mrs. Red,
Yes.
thank you. Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz.
Yes.
One last time, Mr. Westcott.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, that is 20 yes.
Thank you. The motion has been approved. The resolution authorizing the obligation retirement of bond payments from the MFT funds. Mr. Tassoni?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next item is Resolution 21-003. It's a preliminary engineering services agreement for out on Riverside Boulevard between Material Avenue and Sage at a cost of $61,662. It's a budgeted item utilizing MFT funds, and I would so move.
We have a motion to approve by Mr. Tassoni and a second by Mr. Girl and Mr. Kelly, Mr. Billich. Is there any discussion? Hearing and seeing none, Clerk Gamow, can you please call the roll?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni.
Yes.
Thank you all, Mr. Chairman. That's 20 yes.
Thank you, Clerk Gamow. So the resolution authorizing the preliminary engineering service agreement for the improvements of Riverside Boulevard has been approved. Thank you to everybody. Number F is the Public Safety and Judiciary Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Public Safety and Judiciary has one item this evening. It is a Animal Services Ordinance amending section 14-116 fee schedule, and that is to be laid over. Just real quick, this will streamline some language that will make it easier for Animal Services to process adoptions when dealing with people either fixed incomes or low incomes. So that will help out our staff. And also it will raise the fees on adoptions from $110 to $150. This will bring us more in line with other organizations that deal with adoptions of animals. I'll read this in just to be laid over, and we'll vote on it in 2 weeks, just in case there's any questions or concerns from board members on the fees or language. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Girl. Appreciate it. So item number F2 has been laid over, automatically over. Any further business, Mr. Girl?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes our report.
All right, thank you, Mr. Girl. So we move on to agenda item number 10 is unfinished business. Is there any unfinished business in front of this board? Hearing and seeing none. Okay, and number 11 is new business. Is there any new business?
Yeah. Yes.
Mr. Webster.
Yeah, thank you. I have, I don't know, statement or whatever you want to call this, but today it was announced that there was an arrest made and the guy that was shooting up the Cherryvale Mall. I think you all probably saw that notice of that. I don't know all the full details on it there, but what I do know is that according to the notices, the report, that this guy had 2 previous gun charges against him. And so I'm thinking this guy, if he's already had 2 gun charges against him, in all likelihood, he's probably already been a convicted felon. Now, if that's the case, then this guy should be charged by the feds on this. There's a federal law about a convicted felon with a gun. And so the federal government made this law, just like they made a federal law about bank robbery and a federal law about income tax evasion. And they do the prosecutions in these matters. So they made the law about felon with a gun. So I've been harping about this for years. So the feds, in my mind, should be prosecuting this guy. They should be taking over the prosecution of this, and our services, our local services, our state's attorney's office and the courts, all this other stuff should be set aside for any prosecutions we may want to have locally. Let the feds step in right now, immediately, and do their job. Because a felon with a gun, the law, the federal law for that is a minimum 5 years in the penitentiary. 5 years. Now they made the law, they need to enforce this. And I will remind you once again, if the feds stepped in and did their job instead of cherry picking, if they stepped in and did their job, they would be, the federal prosecutors would step in. Our people don't have to do that. Secondly, when the guy is still incarcerated in our jail, pending his court appearances in that, we get paid for that because he's now a federal prisoner. Next, if the guy does get convicted by the feds, they're going to send him to a federal penitentiary somewhere. So he won't be in the neighborhood anymore. He won't be clogging up our Illinois state prison needlessly, when he will be in the federal prison. And so once again, that's less money we have to spend. And I'm talking about we in Winnebago County in the state of Illinois. And further, when the guy is in a federal prison, it won't be anywhere near here. It might be Georgia, Colorado, North Dakota. It will be somewhere far away from his local peeps, his friends, to come and visit him. And so in the meantime, if there are other local charges, I've been told that those other charges can wait until he spends his 5 years or more in the federal prison. And then when he gets out, if we've got local charges against him for having some dope or something on him or some other charges, God knows what. And so I guess what I'm asking here now is I would ask Ms. Vaughn, please, on my behalf, on behalf of the board, please look into this for us. And I'd like to know if the federal government is going to step in this time and do their job. We've got a federal courthouse here, and it's full of federal people. And for God's sakes, please, they should be doing their job. Now, you all know that I'm every bit in favor of lawful gun ownership. I'm 100% behind that. But a felon with a gun, time after time, now this guy's already been charged 2 previous times by the report we got. He should have been in the federal prison right now, as far as I'm concerned. So please look into that for me. And please look into the number of arrests that have happened this year where we've arrested somebody with a gun and if they are already a convicted felon. Because those two should have been prosecuted by the feds, not by us. I'll get off my high horse. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. And I'm sure Ms. Vaughn will look into that for you. I know you've been talking about this for a very long time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there any other new business? Mr. Arena.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the budget, the state budget proposed by the governor, it includes a reduction in the funds that are returned to local government from the income tax, a reduction of 10% of what we had previously received. That would be a reduction of our budget, our revenue of over $588,000. And as all of you know, we are have operated the last several years on a deficit budget. So we have no room to absorb this other than to take it from reserves, which have already fallen below the threshold, which we should maintain. Therefore, I've asked for a resolution to be prepared that we and have it sent to finance so that we can have a conversation on the impact that this would have on our budget, what our options would be, and to make a request to the governor and the General Assembly to not make this reduction in our funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. That's very important, and I agree 100% with the resolution, and it's very important to our community. We have our voices heard with our state legislators and the governor's office. Thank you, Mr. Arena. Mr. Schultz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to refer to Mr. Thompson, the idea of recognizing Steve Chapman's service, longtime service in relation to the county. In some instances, a room, for example, a conference room in the administrative fifth floor section of the administration building might be named in his honor with a plaque or some kind of recognition of Steve. It might be appropriate to do something other than that. I'm not asking for specifics at this time. Obviously, this is fresh news for all of us. But Mr. Thompson, if you would at least give that some consideration as to the appropriateness of that, it's something I think that would be appropriate, but I'm also going to defer to you and the team as far as whether that would be a good thing. And obviously, I know that I speak for all of us when I say how much we appreciate the service that Steve gave us, and just deeply grieved for his family and praying for them in these days. Thank you.
Mr. Schultz, I'm not sure if you heard the news earlier today after the earlier announcement, but Mr. Chapman has not passed away. So there was a miscommunication that came on earlier this morning. So I'm happy to say that Mr. Chapman is still with us, but we can talk further about that as we go along. So thank you. Is there anything further?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is Angela Fellers.
Yes, Ms. Fellers.
This week, as most of us, if you've been watching the news, that you know that the United States reached a very somber and sobering death toll from the COVID-19 pandemic. We've now lost more Americans than what is equal to the entire population of the state of Wyoming, and what is equal to the losses that the United States suffered during World War II, Vietnam, and Korea combined. I would like to, as a board, offer our love and light and our thoughts and prayers to the communities that are affected, their family members and their loved ones. And additionally, on that same note, would like to commend the Winnebago County Health Department, Governor Pritzker for his deployment of the National Guard, the Illinois National Guard, and Mr. Sunil Puri and the First Midwest Group, as well as other entities that work together to open the mass vaccination site at the Sandy Hollow Kmart. Through those efforts, it's my understanding our capacity now is 3,500 vaccinations per day, which puts us on a pretty quick pace to get our community safe so that there's no more needless loss.
Thank you, Ms. Fellers. I agree wholeheartedly. It's a very, very good thing for our community, this mass vaccination site, and agree with all your sentiments. Anything further from county boardman, new business? Mr. Neighbors.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Echoing what Ms. Fellers stated about the vaccination facility, I'd like to thank Dr. Martell and all those who had part in bringing that facility to us and getting it going. It was a beautiful facility. They got everything clean, looking well. I got my first vaccination last week. Looking forward to getting my second vaccination when time allows, and I hope that everyone else is encouraged to do the same. If not, to You know, whether you believe in vaccination or not, it's a good thing for us and it's a good thing for our economy. So I hope everyone considers it, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Neighbors. Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to go along with my members of my committee and say that I got my second shot today, so I'm in full agreement with what they're saying, and I would please ask everybody to have faith in the shots because I think they will work. They've always worked for every other disease we've had, so I don't think there's a reason to be afraid of them. Please get involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. Mr. McCarthy.
Yes, just not so much a reminder, but me being one of the newbies here on the county board, but I'm always out in my community regardless throughout the years. And today I attended the press conference at the Cherry Vale Mall concerning the Valentine's Day incident. And I just can't express how much it is when you're out there, when you're visiting with someone, in this case, attending the press conference and just speaking with the people in the mall. Some live in the area and some do not, but it was reassuring on behalf of the Cherry Valley Mall management and of course, the chief of police here in Cherry Valley and the sheriff's office and also the state's attorney about, we do have a lot going for us here and that mall could not really be any safer. And that these fine ladies and gentlemen of law enforcement are there and they're reassuring us that our neighborhoods are safe and they're doing all what they can do. And it's best to be the eyes, ears, and the nose and every other part, I guess you could say, being involved in your community, being involved in the neighborhood. And some great people I met today that they're really pleased on the direction of the county board.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. With all due respect, go jump in the river.
I'm sorry?
Are you scheduled to jump in the river?
I'm going to be holding the towels tomorrow.
Okay, my mistake. I stand corrected. I think I shocked everybody there, didn't I?
Yeah.
I understood that you're going to be participating in the polar plunge, so I thought I'd throw a little curveball. And
I might be plunged in, but right now I'm standing back. Yeah, I appreciate that, Mr. Booker. Yes,
Okay.
we'll be out there supporting the effort at 6 o'clock in the morning. Very good. Is there any other new business from board members?
Yes, I would like to say one thing.
Yes,
I'm with Joe and I'm with Tim. I've had my second shot too, and man, I'm still standing and living just fine. And those kind of vaccinations stopped smallpox. They stopped polio. They stopped so many diseases that we would be foolish not to go forward and get our shots. Even though I've had it, the COVID, I can still get it back or I can spread it. So I'm glad to be able to participate in getting that. The second thing I wanted to do, I want to thank Mr. Rickard. It's so nice now that we have the consent agenda, which we've always had, but then all of a sudden on Zoom, we didn't get it anymore. So I want to thank you for the auditor's report that we can go back and see that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Gorel.
Would you like me to adjourn?
Well, I think, is there any other announcements or communications, Ms. Gamal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The items listed below were received as correspondence.
Very good, Clerk Gamal. I just do have one more shout out to Sarah Dorner from Rockford United Labor, AFL-CIO, and Lori Laidlaw from ASPE staff representative. They coordinated volunteers for the mass vaccination site for phone banking. They're doing a wonderful job, and I appreciate all their efforts in assisting Winnebago County Health Department and the Emergency Operations Center. So thank you to them. And nothing else. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Second.
Mr. Huffman, and a second by Ms. Gorel and Mr. Girl. All in favor of the adjournment, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Hearing none, we are adjourned. Thank you.